Good afternoon and welcome. We're so pleased to have you, and we're so pleased to have David Kramer and Nicole Bibbins Sedaca. This is the second meeting that we're having on the topic of democracy now and next. I'm going to do a brief introduction of our guests, and we're going to get into an exciting discussion about their work on this important topic, and specifically the working group on elections, media, civil society, and the rule of law. In some ways, I think this is one of the toughest working groups for this task force, so we can get into why that is. We're going to open it up to your questions. So as you are listening to us, be thinking about what you want to ask. Please use the chat function that you'll find to ask your question. We've got a lot of folks here, so we're not able to open up the microphone, but we do want to hear from you. And at the end, I'll have a couple announcements. So David Kramer is coming to us from Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs, where he's a senior fellow in the Václav Havel program for human rights and diplomacy, and he's the director for the European and Eurasia Studies program there. David has a very long career in Washington, D.C., and with both David and Nicole, I'm going to be mentioning a number of institutions that if you are in the democracy and human rights world, particularly if you're working internationally, you will have encountered these organizations. You'll be friends with them for life. So students take note because they're great places to work. So in DC, he has worked at the McCain Institute, where he was senior director for human rights and democracy. He is a previous president of Freedom House. Prior to that, he was a transnational fellow at the German Marshall Fund. He served 8 years in the State Department under President George W. Bush. He was an assistant secretary of state for democracy, human rights, and labor, oftentimes the job that is sort of the gold star that people are excited about in democracy, although I want to say that USAID also has a lot of those interesting jobs as well. He was a deputy assistant secretary at DAS, also at state for European and Eurasian affairs, where he had the enviable job of working Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova. Nicole Bibbins Sedaca comes to us from Georgetown University, and we are so grateful for Nicole's participation and collaboration in this effort. And welcome to the Georgetown students and faculty that are with us today. She's the Deputy Director and Chair for Global Politics and Security Concentration in the Master of Science in the Foreign Service Program. She's a professor of several courses on democracy, human rights, and ethics. She also served at the State Department for a decade working on democracy and human rights issues, and also worked at the International Republican Institute on local governance in Ecuador, which I think probably did better than my efforts at political party development for the National Democratic Institute in Moscow. So you're hearing the State Department, Freedom House, the McCain Institute. Actually, David also spent time at CSIS. Of course, Freedom House, the McCain Institute, and CSIS are co-sponsors of the task force, which has brought us together. IRI and NDI being the organizations that are working overseas on these issues. So with that, let's turn right to David. Tell us first, David, and then Nicole, what is the charge of your specific working group? What are you asked to do by this task force?
Sarah, well, first, thanks very much for this opportunity, and it's great to be with my longtime and old friend Nicole and partner on many different things. But we were asked to look at elections, the media, civil society, and then we also tacked on rule of law and accountability. But the thrust of our working group was on the importance of elections, the critical role played by the media, and the indispensable role played by civil society. But we also had to take an honest look at what's been happening in democracies around the world, where I think with Freedom House's report coming out very soon, its annual Freedom in the World report, we'll see a 15th year of decline when it comes to political rights and civil liberties. So we acknowledge that democracy has been on the defense and has been facing threats both internally and externally. Internally from populist leaders, from demagogues, and we here in the United States are not immune from that threat. Then there are the external threats that coming from Russia and China, as well as Iran on a second tier. And those threats are also serious. Those are homes to regimes that see democracy as a threat to their grip on power. And so they do what they can to try to undermine democracies. In the case of China, possibly trying to hold up their model as a better system than ours, than our democratic system. In the case of Russia, it's to try to get everyone dirty and suggest that. So we analyze that, and then we launch into a series of various recommendations that we maybe can get into in further discussion.
Nicole, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. First, let me just say thank you to you, Sarah, and to CMU for this series and for the partnership with Georgetown. Delighted to have our two institutions working together, and obviously always delighted to be with my colleague David, who is unquestionably one of the most respected democracy advocates. Used to be in town, but now in the country, we'll just put it broader since he's fled to the warmer climates of Florida. I think the challenge that we faced, the entire task force faced, but certainly this subgroup, was to say, in light of where the world is now, entering into its 15th year of decline, and in light of the political changes we've had in the United States and the opportunity that comes with that, what are not just ways to name the problems, but also to have impactful solutions that go to the core elements of what democracies need, the institutions, the processes, and the individuals that have to be strengthened in this process to ensure that democracies are resilient to non-democratic forces, to populist forces, to external threats, but also that some of those that have been backsliding or have weak can be strengthened at this time so that they have resilient institutions. So happy to get into the details as we go forward.
So we're going to go into the details in a sec. As I noted, the three of us collectively have practically nearly a century working on this, maybe a little bit less.
I have that on my own, I think.
I'm only bringing 4 years to the table.
So, if we were doing this 10 years ago, this would look and feel so different. I mean, it is really stunning. We anticipated, I think, in part what's happened. But over the course of our working as a task force, we lived through the 77 days and then, of course, the siege on January 6th. Talk a little bit about this domestic moment, because it's not something that we as veterans of this community have spent a lot of time working on, and yet it seems impossible to talk about advancing democracy or countering authoritarianism and not talk about our domestic moment. Mm-hmm. Nicole, you want to go first?
Yeah, happy to. David and I met at the early days of the Bush administration, and what a very different world we live in, and what a very different time it is. We worked under a president who made democracy the cornerstone of what his administration would base its foreign policy on. And now we're seeing an administration and President Biden who is doing a similar task to elevate the role and the importance of democracy. Certainly it is a bipartisan effort, but what we've seen is a lot of challenges in between. One of the biggest challenges I think that we see is 10, 15, 20 years ago, talking about democracy was almost a given. And it was what people accepted as the cornerstone of the international system, of the basis of the United Nations, the basis of many of the multilateral relationships. And now we are finding ourselves somewhat on the defensive, having to explain the very foundations of democracy. The fact that the United States has had such a troubling recent history, I would say certainly to see President Trump act in many instances in ways which are contrary, I think, to the values of our country. But certainly to have our election questioned the way it was continually and undermined as it was, and then to have violent actors try and interrupt one of the most foundational processes is troubling. But I think what's important for us to take away from that, certainly tremendously troubling and in no way trying to minimize that, is to take away two lessons. One, that democracy worked on January 6th. It wasn't easy, but two important things to take away. It is the same day that a southern state in the United States elected a Black senator and a Jewish senator, one who's a pastor and one who's a journalist. All of those things are almost impossible in a lot of societies, but it happened in the United States as a sign of the trajectory that our country is on. Also, after the violence in the Capitol, all of the lawmakers came back, and the election that happened in November was certified, and the transition of power began. And so it's important to, I think in many ways that encapsulates the challenge of democracy, which is it's hard, and it is going to have setbacks, and it's going to have challenges, and strong institutions are necessary to overcome those challenges. And if anything, this is the time to double down. So that's the first point. The second is people have looked at the United States and said, well, the United States is out of the game. You guys messed it up. January 6th was a disaster. I take a different take, which is we have a strong story to tell, which is democracy is fragile. Democracy will never be done, but we have been on a path for hundreds of years, not since January 6th, but of hundreds of years of refining and working on this process. And that's the story that we go out into the world to speak from, a point of humble confidence, as we've talked about, of the challenges we've had and how democracy has helped us overcome them.
David, anything to add? That was very eloquent, Nicole, that you really captured. And I think it's actually really important to remember the aspects that actually did work, no matter how sort of traumatizing it was to watch it. And of course, all the work that is left still to be done. But David, did you want to add anything?
Just very briefly, because I agree. I think Nicole captured it extremely well. I think the past couple of years, but in particular the past few months, have reminded us that the United States, while I strongly believe remains the indispensable nation in the world, is not exceptional. We suffer from some of the same problems that other countries do. We were founded on the basis of racism. And inequality, all of these challenges that other countries face, it was brought home to us that we face those as well. And yet, because people struggling for freedom and human rights and democracy around the world look to the United States for leadership, we have to stay in that leadership role. We don't have a choice, in my view, but moreover, it serves our interest to do so. It isn't just because other people are looking at us. Living in a more democratic world means we will have a more safe and secure environment. We'll have better trade partners. We won't face threats of terrorism as much as you would from unstable authoritarian regimes. So trying to work in helping promote democracy, some people don't like the verb promote, but to advance and support democracy around the world, human rights, is both the right thing to do, and it also serves our national interests.
We're going to return to that in a bit, because I think it's really important to actually put a person's face on this, right? Because a lot of times when we talk about democracy promotion, we're talking about institutions, but we are living through, and we're very conscious of the fact that we're living through a lot of, both, whether you're looking at Myanmar or Belarus or Russia, people, brave people, standing up for their rights. So we're going to return to that, because I think it's confusing sometimes to colleagues and students, given everything that's going on inside the United States. Why would we do this? How can we do this? You've given a good sort of top level foreign policy why, but let's return to that in a second. Tell us about your specific recommendations that you have that you're making for the task force, because I think they're interesting, they're challenging, and I'm sure that the students are going to have some questions. Who wants to go first? You've got 6, I believe.
Yeah, go ahead, Nicole, if you want.
Maybe we'll just split them in half. I'll do the math It's 3 each. So we started with a Center for Integrity in Elections. Obviously, democracy is not just elections, but elections are pivotal because they are a way to capture in one moment of time the interests of citizens and the importance of those processes, of electoral processes being sound and people feeling that their voice will actually be heard because the process that they're engaging in will be respected by the outcomes. And that leads to a peaceful transition of power. And that's what in many countries has been pivotal to signal to people that democracy is strong and that democracy is possible. Our second recommendation was an enterprise fund for independent media. We have seen around the world how journalists have been targeted by authoritarian regimes, and it's no question why, because they are the independent voice that reflects so much of the sentiment that exists in a society, whether that is to uncover corruption, to identify weak governance practices, or to raise awareness about problems that exist in a society, whether they are health problems or inequality or whatever they are. The media is crucial to that process. And because they are outside of government, but still a part of a democracy, it's essential that they are strong and professional. The third one is women's political and civic leadership. We have seen around the world both the silencing of women and the limitation of their roles in leadership, but we've also seen in many countries how pivotal the role of women have been to strong leadership in countries. And so what we recognize is by strengthening women's leadership around the world, we are able to continue to sow into the fabric of democracies or democratizing nations. Let me just turn it over to David for the other 3.
Sure. And the next one follows on from the one Nicole mentioned about women leaders, and that is to tap into young leaders, whether male or female, in trying to form a coalition for democracy. And we've suggested that at a summit for democracy that President Biden intends to host, presumably later this year, that he could launch this kind of coalition. It's a cliche, obviously, that the young people are the hope for the future, but it also happens to be true. The next one is to bolster support for human rights activists, dissidents, and journalists. When Nicole and I were both at the State Department, there was a new program launched to provide emergency assistance to these kinds of individuals. And I worked on it at State, and I continued it when I was at Freedom House. It's a program that doesn't attract a lot of attention, deliberately so, but it's one that provides, I think, a lifeline, quite literally in some cases, to people who run into trouble in various parts of the world. The last one calls for pushing back against authoritarian threats and backsliding democracies. Too often we have been on the defense, and we feel it's time to, if you will, go on the offense a little bit, put the authoritarian regimes on their heels through greater naming and shaming of their repressive measures, exposing corruption, cleaning up our own house, since corruption coming from, say, Russia, not really be a problem if we didn't import corruption from Russia. So we need to do a better job. And refusing to host any authoritarian leaders in Oval Office meetings at the White House. This too might be a way of sending signals to some of the backsliding countries that pose real thorny challenges on how we deal with some countries that are fellow NATO allies. But the direction, and not to lump these into the same category, but the directions in Poland, Hungary, and Turkey in particular pose, I think, some real challenges for us. I'll just very quickly add, we are still working through what to recommend when it comes to security assistance, in particular for Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Egypt is the second largest recipient of foreign aid from the United States. The situation there is absolutely appalling and getting worse every day. And Saudi Arabia is engaged in a war with Yemen in which there are gross human rights violations, if not absolute war crimes. And the United States is providing the means by which Saudi Arabia engages in this activity, to say nothing of Saudi Arabia's own internal situation. But the last one, and I'll stop, is we're also trying to figure out what we recommend to bolster parliamentary independence and its role as a check and balance on potential government abuses. So that's one we're still working on.
We're getting questions coming in, but let me just pull out a few things. Then I want to hear about your own personal journeys, because you obviously worked for President Bush. So you're coming from the Republican Party. At one point, that party has gone through a lot of transition. But let me just pull out a few comments. This issue of the Oval Office, I think, is really important. We have lots of symbolic tools, a lot of ways in which we can signal to the world. And it's important to recognize that the time of the president is extremely important. And so giving space for authoritarians in the Oval Office is ridiculous. It has no place. So I thank you for that. This issue about Russian and other funds coming into the US, I think is really critical, and one that I think if you think back over 20 years, we would not have recognized how much our own financial institutions, real estate firms played a facilitating role in allowing those illicit gains to not just in the United States, but other democracies. And so one of the things that I'm interested in seeing through the year 2021 is how much we can pull together to push back on some of that. A lot of what you're saying is not terribly controversial, and we'll return to it, although some of it is extremely difficult considering where we are at the moment. But talk to us about, you both have a Republican past. Where do you see yourselves now? Independent? It's a personal question, but I think it's one that's really striking for people who have such honorable service as you do in your past and hopefully in your future. Obviously you can serve in government. There's a role as citizens that we're all playing in this, but just tell us a little bit about what you're thinking about right now. Nicole, do you want to start?
Thank you, David, for ceding the floor. Let me start by, I have always been an independent, but I have leaned right for a very long time, and I remain there because I am conservative politically. Let's start with the point. Every democracy needs at least two, it would be lovely to have more, but two very strong functioning parties, in large part because there is no society in the entire world where everybody believes the same thing politically. What we unfortunately are doing, because of the elements within the Republican Party that have unquestionably, in my view, undermined democracy, not the entire Republican Party, but elements within the Republican Party, including the president, have undermined democracy. There is a movement to say, well, let's toss that all out. But I would argue, here's a different way of thinking about it. We are building a wall right now between left and right. And people are saying everything on the other side should go. I would love for us to build a different wall, not a border wall, so let's move away from that. But I'll do it like a wall around what is the legitimate political spectrum in our country. Everything inside are people who believe strongly in democracy, believe strongly that it's important to have a rigorous debate that brings different views to the table, and people can debate out left and right. And everything outside of that circle on the other side of the wall are people who don't believe in fundamental democratic principles. But the reality is, if we all dig deep, someone from our side is going to be outside of that wall. And that's what's important. What the shift that we have to have in the United States is to say all of us are going to be willing to call out those in our tribe, in our group. Doesn't matter if you're left or right, but it is to say, I believe in democracy and I believe in my political views, right? And I'm going to say Liz Cheney did that, and she's getting pilloried right now for it. She said, I'm a conservative, I'm a Republican, but I also think what happens wrong, I'm going to vote for impeachment. She made that distinction between what is her view, her partisan view, and what is fundamentally a democracy view. I think people need to do that increasingly more from Republicans, but I also think Democrats are going to have to say, if there's anything that comes up, we have to distinguish and say we need space, and it's in everyone's interest to have a rigorous debate where we have all legitimate democracy-loving voices at the table, whether they are left or right, because that is what will make our democracy stronger. We will not be stronger if we close off the voices. we will be stronger if we close off the undemocratic voices.
Nicole, before I go to David, can you
Please.
unpack for me what you mean by, what does it mean to be conservative to you?
Yeah, so, you know, I mean, I think it is shifting. Stop laughing, David. I think it's shifting because I think many of us who have supported the Republican Party have sort of felt a little bit homeless. So I believe that the United States should have a foreign policy that is based on our democratic values. That is actually what drew me first and foremost working for President Bush. And I'm delighted now to be a fellow at the Bush Institute, the George W. Bush Institute. And I believe that that is something that the Republican Party had stood for. I think parties change over time. If you look at what happened in our country in the 50s and 60s, a flip-flop of what the party identity is. So for me, it is more of the conservative values and what underpins our foreign policy that have been central to how I align politically. I don't align with a party right now because I think what the Republican Party has gone through most recently has shown an unwillingness to stand for some of the values which I find most important.
David, tell us about your journey. I was with you in Estonia. We were at a meeting in honor of the first post-liberation president, if you will, of Estonia, Lennart Meri. And Estonia, of course, such an interesting example of a country, a people, a government who, as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed and they were liberated, they ran as fast as they could towards democracy, towards Europe. And you stood up and you were talking about how you were an independent. And it was, I suppose it was a little bit shocking to me. This is over 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago now. And I wanted to hear a little bit, what was that? What happened there?
Well, I was a political appointee in the Bush administration, so I've been a Republican for almost my whole adult life, and recognized that President Bush was not flawless. There were a number of issues that were problematic, including when I was in the Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Bureau that we had to acknowledge and address. But I continued, and then when President Obama was elected, I left government and continued hanging around in Republican circles. And then in 2015-16, I think that's when the break started within the party. At that point, it was a very small fraction of us who became, as the term has been coined, never Trumpers. I was a never Trumper from the beginning and continued, got into a little hot water for it at one point. And then when I moved to Miami a year after I registered to vote, I left the Republican Party, although I prefer to say the Republican Party left me. And I became an independent, and I'm still an independent. But I agree with everything Nicole said, and I am worried about where the party is right now and where it's heading. There seems to be a major rift in the party, but for now, the majority, rather sizable majority, are siding on the pro-Trump side. And I'm sure you saw Adam Kinzinger's op-ed in the Washington Post today, and Nicole mentioned Liz Cheney. I sort of stand with them, I have to say. I think they are standing up for what they truly believe in. They're standing up for democratic principles. And it reminds me more of the Republican Party that I had joined rather than what we've seen over, say, the past 4+ years.
Let me ask you a little bit of a hardball question, and then we have a bunch of questions that have come into the chat function. I know that you guys have thought about this, create a Center for Integrity in Elections. Who wants to hear from us about elections? And I want to just note for the students in particular, I don't mean it to sound either rude or obnoxious, but obviously we've got issues domestically. The thing that's crazy about all this is that we internationally have been a huge part of a global movement in best practices on elections and norms around elections. The U.S. as a bipartisan government, NGOs working overseas. I mean, all of us have worked in numerous elections overseas. And if we were looking at the US, we'd be making recommendations, this is insane. You've got a terrible system. So talk to us a little bit more about this, create a Center for Integrity in Elections.
Do you want me to jump in on that? So three points on that. I would argue that the United States' greatest problem right now is not our elections. It's not. We actually had an election. It wasn't decided that night, and the processes worked to figure out who won in each state. And we had a huge insurrection that was highly problematic, but it was certified and we had a free transition of a peaceful transition of power. I actually think the problem is not in our electoral system. The problem is in information in our country, and I saw one of our colleagues put that in the chat. We have a significant problem in our country if a large percentage of our population believes that it was not free and fair. That to me is not an electoral system problem. That is an information problem. It's huge. I think that is the thing which the United States has to deal with, because I have spoken to friends who believe that on the 6th, those people were patriots. And they think that I am delusional, and I think they are delusional. And we have two completely different narratives, and it has been stoked by a president, our former president, who did it, I think, singularly for personal gain, but it has started what is two competing narratives. So that actually, I think, is the greatest problem. So and then secondly, I would say the United States is going to be in a leadership role, whether we like it or not, whether we deserve it or not, we will be in a leadership role. And David made this point so well before, the question is, what are we going to say when we are out about in the world? And if we are going to engage in other countries, then we ought to engage in the things which matter. And elections matter in addition to other things. And so if we are out there and saying, democracy matters. First off, we're leading. Democracy matters, but we're not going to talk about this because January 6th was nightmarish. That does not serve anyone in the countries, and it doesn't serve our interests. Lastly, if anyone thinks that the United States goes out into the world because we have a perfect track record, has not read American history. We go out in the world because the values are right, not because we are always right. And if we were to step back from that voice and to say election integrity doesn't matter, and so we're not going to use our power and our money and our influence for that good thing, then we are abandoning the values. We're not abandoning ourselves, we are abandoning our values. And truthfully, those values don't change. Those values are actually the same ones that brought us through the civil rights movement. They're the same ones that brought us through January 6th, and they were the same ones that will move us forward. The fact that we keep failing does not make those values any less important. It means we need to work on our behavior, our institutions to live into those values. And when we go abroad, we need to keep talking about those values and those institutions.
But Nicole, you bring up a really important point, which I think certainly I, as a former representative of NDI, you as a former representative of IRI, we all as former government folks may not have been able to do this. Our flaws are now so evident in terms of inequality, inequities, racial justice in this country, and addressing those issues. I think this has been a real conversation in this task force. This has to be part of the conversation in ways that it hasn't been previously. How do you see that fitting in the recommendations that you guys are advancing?
So I think it is absolutely essential that the United States talk about the fact that we have work to do at home, right? I also think no one in the world woke up to American injustice when George Floyd was murdered. Mm-hmm. People in our own country did, but I promise you, when I walked around the world, as I traveled around the world as an African American, I promise you, people said, "What are you talking about?" When you know the history in your own country for Native Americans, for African Americans, for women, for any number of groups. The fact that we are having a more comprehensive and wholesome debate now in the United States is a little bit of a rhetorical catch-up what we should have been doing. But again, what we talk about, the values that we talk about, well, we talk about them differently, but we don't need to stop talking about them. And I think that's going to be the important thing. It's not whether we talk about them, it's just how we talk about them. And what we need to say is, boy, are we grappling with some of the challenges in our society? Racial injustice is one, but this double narrative that is going on in the United States and the elements of our society that are not committed to little d democracy and everyone having a voice. That's who was in the Capitol on January 6th. That is one of the biggest challenges we'll have. And the United States, I think, can now speak from a point, again, of this term humble confidence, of being humble about our track record, but rock solid confident that the values do not change because we are waking up to our shortcomings in them.
Anything to add, David, or should I go to the question?
Well, let me just make a few quick points. Sure. One is, as Nicole said at the end, the importance of humility, I think, cannot be overstated. We need to approach raising these issues around the world with an even stronger dose of humility, I think, than we did before, but we always have.
Can you make it concrete? Like how specific, like how do we demonstrate, how do we live humility? You're Tony Blinken. What's your recommendation?
Let me give you an example from my own experience. In 2008, I went to Beijing to lead the resumption of the U.S.-China human rights dialogue. Spent the first 90 minutes talking about the challenges we face in the United States. And as a result of that, we didn't come back to whataboutism that the Chinese might have thrown in our face for the rest of the dialogue. We didn't accomplish much else, I'll acknowledge that. But at least the conversation didn't get dragged into a gutter fight over who has a worse system. We were upfront and honest about the challenge. You know, it was renditions, Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, you name it, and we addressed those head on. And so I think that's an approach that the current administration is going to take.
I think that's great advice.
I had a similar reaction you did. The two of you may have been on the task force call. It was 2 days after January 6th, and I basically said, you know, why do we have a recommendation about an election integrity center? I actually have come around to the view that we need to, again, but with the humility that is a critical part of that. Third, I've never seen any U.S.-led initiatives advocating other countries to adopt our electoral college. And so what we do is advocate on behalf of universal values and fundamental features of democracy that are universal. And that's where I think we can make inroads. We're not trying to push our system on others. We're not saying this is an American value set or a European value set or even a Western value set. These are universal values that we are espousing and that everyone is striving for, except for those in authoritarian positions of power.
Can I just build on that really quickly? We're now revealing all of our pains and scars from our human rights dialogues with China. Where I sat through a very similar thing and they showed pictures of Abu Ghraib, and people will show pictures of George Floyd's life being snuffed out of him in a brutal, inhumane way. But what we have to talk about, and again, never to minimize the seriousness of these events, is to say what happened: free and open and peaceful protests all around our country. That is what democracy is actually about. I would argue that they're probably not Uyghurs in other countries in China who are able to do that. And that does not minimize Mr. Floyd's death. What it does is it says it honors his death by showing that we will have a process. People went to the street and protested. We have a president who has now talked about it openly. We have conversations going on at the local level between police officers and civil society groups. That is actually what democracy looks like. And we have to just continue to come back. Democracy doesn't mean we'll be perfect. It means when those imperfections are brought to light, all of the democratic institutions, our media will report on it, our people will go to the street and protest, our lawmakers will change laws. That is actually what the democratic process looks like.
So let's stay with a question from the audience specifically about information. I'm just going to read from it, but isn't another real problem what people do, how they react to the information they're getting. Was an insurrection an appropriate response to the information they believe to be true about the election not being valid? I mean, it really gets to the point that you've made, both of you. We've got this fundamental problem. The elections actually worked, but if people don't believe the information, is this about going back to civic education? I mean, are there some really sort of basic things that we need to be doing? Is it
Yes,
a result of?
I would say, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, civic education has kind of disappeared. And so we need to do a much better job. I think, you know, when social media came about, people were enthusiastic that it was going to lead to greater freedom, that people who had been suppressed would finally have a means by which to find out information and also convey their own opinions. And that has been true in part, but it also has become a horrible medium by which disinformation and misinformation have been spread. And it isn't just social media, to be fair. Cable news networks have
Absolutely.
a very nefarious role in this. There, you know, to be a journalist, your job is to report the news, not to twist it and contort it to fit a specific political agenda. And whether you like or hate CNN, like or hate MSNBC, or like or hate Fox News, their job should be to report the news as they see it, with the cover of a political agenda, and then let the viewers determine. Now, viewers, in my view, and readers also have a responsibility to open themselves to a diverse set of news sources. Because if they see something, there is this tendency in this country, and probably not just in this country, to only read or watch the things that reinforce your views. I can be guilty of this myself sometimes, but I think we all have a responsibility to try to widen our scope as much as possible so that we can make sure what we're hearing or reading is in fact the case.
Let me try and tie a few different questions together. On the one hand, you mentioned naming and shaming, and this, to me, my former dissertation advisor, Jack Snyder, has written about these tactics actually not being terribly successful. On the other hand, in a more positive light, there's actually, I would say, and I experienced this when I was in the Obama administration, a kind of 21st century approach to anti-corruption work that emphasizes transparency and accountability. That trust is an issue that the students keep bringing up in our conversations. Trust is a really important issue. So I guess the question for both of you is, to what extent, how do you balance this naming and shaming with a sort of more positive approach that is really focused on transparency, building trust, and accountability?
Particularly dealing with foreign countries, you're meaning, or?
I think it applies both, right? I mean, I think it's what happens here is going to happen there. Although I confess that all this domestic is international and international is domestic sometimes confuses me, but these things apply in both places.
This is where I think elevating the rhetoric to a level of principle and not partisanship is so important, right? Because if someone believes that you are talking to them about a principle that applies equally to me as it does to you, then you can enter into a conversation. There can be trust, because then they know that the criticism that I might be levying, I'm levying because of a higher principle, right? Universal human rights, or the free and open elections that people should be having, as opposed to me using it for my personal or political gain. If we enter into those conversations talking about the integrity of democracy, and if I am willing to say, for me, the integrity of democracy then means I'm going to protect the space for people I disagree with to talk and people I agree with to talk, then people will see in my actions that I'm actually advocating based on principle, not on party. For example, I worked in religious freedom for a very long time. And one of the main principles we talked about, I'm a Christian. I have to advocate for people who think radically different things, whether they are Jewish or Muslim or Hindu or agnostic or atheist. And the reason is the space has to be open for all people to worship or not worship, or to change their faith, or then I am not protected in my faith. And that's the same principle that applies, which is we have to ensure that we're creating the space for all people in order for us then to come with our particular group. I think that also goes with our allies or people or countries around the world. If we go to Saudi Arabia and have a conversation, say, look, we can talk about shared security interests, but we're going to talk about our unwavering commitment to human rights, and we're not going to change that because we're friends with you today or not friends with you tomorrow. The bar for your support in Yemen is not because we like you or we don't. It is because what is going on in Yemen is wrong. That is the way we need to speak with integrity. And that is how you build trust, is because people know that your word is your word. And so the principles, regardless of to whom you're talking.
David, do you want to defend shaming?
Yeah, no, to be clear, it's one of 9 points that we make under this recommendation. It's naming and shaming, exposing corruption, increasing sanctions, exposing Western organizations that receive funding from Russia and China, exposing gongos, these are government NGOs, if that's not an oxymoron, treating RT and Sputnik, CCTV as propagandists, not as media outlets, linkage, all these things. What troubles me about people who don't like any of those is, okay, so what would you do? Are we simply supposed to roll our eyes and turn the page, look the other way? If we don't like that Alexei Navalny was poisoned, we don't like that he was arrested upon his return. I mean, he was nearly killed by the Russian government, which has a track record of either killing or trying to kill people. Are we supposed to say, well, nice job, I hope you finish the job the next time? I mean, it really kind of baffles me when people who criticize sanctions, and yes, sanctions have been overused, but people who don't like sanctions, what would you do instead? How would you convey that an action by a repressive regime is unacceptable? Because if you don't do anything, and naming and shaming is something, it's not enough, but it's something, then you are accepting it. You are making the unacceptable acceptable. And I also don't know any government that likes to be named and shamed. They all push back on it. None of them likes to be sanctioned. Mr. Putin has spent an awful lot of time trying to get sanctions on his country and his circle lifted unsuccessfully. So I take the point that some feel it maybe is not effective. What's the alternative? And I never hear a convincing answer to that question.
So again, let me try and combine a few questions. We are very focused on this potential upcoming Summit for Democracy. It occurs to me that making sure this is a bipartisan effort, or at least the parts of the Republican Party that are in essence reflecting what Nicole was saying earlier, inside that Democratic small d space are part of that. But it also, and this goes to a question that's in the chat, what are the platforms for discussion? Do we have enough platforms that allow for debate? How do you make sure that the debate is done in a respectful way so that we don't end up going to our, respective corners? Do you think we need a different or new kind of institution to address this? And I'm going to read it exactly. Do you believe the platforms for debate we currently have are useful enough to allow for these discussions you consider essential to our democracy? If not, how would you suggest we expand our institutions to allow for the expression of more viewpoints?
And this is domestically focused?
I can't tell. This is from Samuel.
Okay.
Sounds like it is domestically focused.
Okay. Yeah. So, let me just relate something. Jim Colby, who's a former congressman from Arizona, a great guy, now I think still with the German Marshall Fund, told me years ago. Jim had served in Congress, I think, for 22 years, and he said the 3 curses for Congress, and using Congress as a broader look at the overall polarization and political paralysis, are gerrymandering, which means that members who are elected play to one extreme or the other. There's no incentive to go to the middle. Fundraising, because that's all members do in their free time, which means they don't get together and socialize. And then this leads to the third, cable news shows, because it's easy to go on a cable news show and yell at somebody and disparage somebody if you actually don't know them. And the reason you don't know them is because you were too busy fundraising. So I think reforming the way our officials are elected would be a positive thing. That doesn't change the institution. It simply changes the way one of our key institutions currently functions or doesn't function, as the case may be.
So I like the way that you've actually really fundamentally separate out this question of, democracy working from, we have really specific problems. I will say, and those of you who know me know I can be quite critical of the UN. There are a million things that are wrong with the UN. One of the things that is actually right is that people do socialize, that actually having a relationship with somebody creates a certain kind of culture. It doesn't always mean, obviously, that you get stuff done, but you can't negotiate with somebody if you don't have a relationship with them. Nicole, you wanted to get in on this?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with all the points that David made, but let me just add 3 others, which I think bring us even down one level more granular, and is something that everyone on this call could take on as their own task. Universities have a massive, important role in cultivating civil dialogue. I think that they have to see it as they are democracy advocates. If universities are not having debates on campus with more than one view, then they are not doing their job. And so for every issue, if you have a panel about US foreign policy in the Middle East, you should ensure that there's someone on the panel who thinks we should be, actively engaged, others who think we shouldn't be that engaged, others who think we should support this solution or that solution. We have to have all of the debates, and it has to be held civilly so that people just actually see that that is what a normal debate is about. I think we are literally forgetting that that is a thing. The second is, I do think we have to push this conversation down to a local level. People have to see these conversations happening. And I do think that mayors and governors and others have to see it as their responsibility for the integrity of our democracy to conduct town halls and other types of public events in a way that promotes not just the outcome that people want, but also civil debate. And the last is, all of us use social media, some of us better or more actively than others. Don't know who we're talking about. You choose how your voice shows up. Every single one of us. And if you have someone from your tribe, right, from your circle of friends, from your political party, from your church, from wherever, that is saying something that's undemocratic, you got to call them out. You need to challenge people to communicate their ideas in a way that is both integrity filled to the point that they want to, but also integrity filled to our democracy. So if they say, X politician is a terrorist, kill him, that is not allowed, right? He's actually, or she's probably not a terrorist. Choose a word of how you will criticize people in a way which is constructive within a dialogue, within a democracy. Again, don't silence your voice. It's not cancel culture. It's about learning that civil debate happens. And if it can't happen on social media, which it most often cannot, then choose a way to do it in another way that is not 144 characters or on your Facebook page.
Hey, Sarah, can I just add one thing to that? Because I'm sure the 3 of us have done this with our students in mentoring, but one of the problems, many problems of social media, and I don't tweet, I am not on Facebook, I'm on none of it, but one of the problems of social media is there's no editing function. You just blur it out what comes to mind. And all I can urge all of your students, and I say this to my students too, think twice before you hit the send button, because these things don't disappear. And if you want to get a government security clearance, if you are looked into for a certain job, some of the things that you have said or written on social media could come back to bite you. So just be careful. Pretend it's like submitting a paper to your class or an op-ed for a newspaper or something. That will, be reviewed. You'll get a grade or it'll be rejected or accepted by the paper. Because other people are looking at it before it sees the light of day. And so social media is too often, I think, just this instinctive reflex that can get people in trouble.
Those are incredibly wise words, and probably everybody was glued to their computer, their TV sets, if you will. Extremely
deleting
important.
Their accounts.
Yeah, right.
Can I just add a challenge on that, Sarah? I would love for people to think about, does every post, except for David, who doesn't post or anything, for everyone who does post, could your most right-leaning and left-leaning friend look at that and look at and say, that is an integrity-filled comment. I don't agree with it, but it is an integrity-filled comment, right? If you are getting, and it's not about likes, but if you're getting likes and thumbs up and all the important things that we measure our entire lives by these days from people who are radically opposed, it means that you are speaking with integrity and you're presenting your partisan view consistent with democratic values. That has been how I have tried to post. No one can impugn me for anything that I say, except that it's my view, but they can't impugn how I put it, and they can't say that I've thrown someone else under the bus unfairly in this process. That will up our debate massively if everyone actually took that on as a challenge.
So this goes really to a question. We have 3 minutes and I have a really brief advertisement that I want to get to before we hang up. This comes from Scout. I ask because who is defining whether these values are fair, just, and all-inclusive? I think it's worth further analyzing the framework of these values, what the people of this country as a whole value. I don't know if I'm doing justice to this question. The question is really about the values of each political institution or the values of the US Constitution. Do we see actually a conflict in, is this really a values debate? I mean, that really what we're talking about is we don't have a shared core of values. We maybe used to, maybe we never did, but is this really about values?
I would argue that we don't share all of the same values. We are 330 million people in the world. We don't all, I mean, in our country.
In the country.
We all don't share the same values. We don't share the same backgrounds, faith, race, whatever. But we do have a unifying thing, which is our democracy and our democratic values. The way I would measure that question of values is not about what your personal values are, but the democratic values of our country, and are they applying consistently to everybody? And here's the test. If you think a behavior is right or wrong, and you think it should be silenced or you think it should be encouraged, would you feel the same for somebody else who you don't like, right? The violence that we saw on January 6th is not wrong because I disagree with those people. It is wrong because it undermined a democratic process.
Right. Yeah, the consistency point is critical.
Yeah, and I think if we can say, I'm going to keep the space open because it is a democratic value, that is the litmus test. That is the measuring stick that we need to use to say, would I want that space to be open for someone I disagree with? And if I'm going to cut off violent action or other action, would I do that for people of my own party or my own group? Mm-hmm. And that is where we then know that we are finding that place of democratic unity.
So this time next week, okay, go ahead, David. Mm-hmm.
But, look, I just update our founding documents and say all men and women are created equal. And that to me is the cornerstone of what we need to approach, which is discrimination, and that we should treat everyone as an equal. And I have to say before we go, because I would really regret it if I didn't, forgive me if I butcher your name, but Stamatis Marinus's screen wins the prize for the best screen on this box here. If you guys don't, as a dog owner, I love it. So.
Okay, folks, that was a challenge. That was important to get in. Yeah. This time next week, Nicole is going to join us again. We're going to be talking with our colleague Ashley Korku and me about the Summit for Democracy on tomorrow in something called American Purpose, which is a new platform that both David and I have enjoyed. I have a piece coming out on the Summit for Democracy, and we'll have a session on Friday at noon. You can register at American Purpose to listen to it. I'll be joined by colleagues who will also be talking about disinformation. Steve Feldstein from Carnegie Endowment and Peter Ponomarev, whose name I just butchered, who's an incredibly interesting author looking at Russia. So it's going to be more democracy talk on Friday at noon. And Friday at 1, and Nicole with us this time next week, starting at noon. Thank you so much. I apologize if I didn't get to your question or I phrased it in a way that is not how you meant it to be asked. But keep it coming, and we'll see you next week. Please stay safe and healthy, and we'll see you soon. Thank you,
Thanks.
Nicole. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Stay well.